Are we investing in radical societal surgery, turning rotten?
Cillian Murphy's first ever Netflix film, Steve, is nothing short of an emotional roller coaster. Adapted directly from Max Porter's very famous novel, Shy, Steve is an intimate and unfiltered movie about a reform school that's on the very brink of closing down. After his blockbuster performance as Oppenheimer, a film such as this is definitely quite the detour from the power-riding protagonists that Murphy is famous for playing, because in this Netflix adaptation, he plays the titular character who's about to lose everything he had worked so hard for and is reeling from the exhaustion of trying to hold himself together. Directed by Tim Milans, the movie follows head teacher Steve on one fraught day at Stanton Wood Manor, which is a progressive but severely underfunded residential school for troubled young men. So, what happens to the film's titular character in 24 chaotic hours at the school? Without wasting another moment, let's get right into it. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves though, we do have a very quick request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
That is your basic duty of care.
What is the film's initial premise? The film opens in the year 1996 with Steve arriving at Stanton Woods Manor, an old English estate turned into a last-chance reform college that's specifically modeled on Finland's rehabilitative system. His day is looking complicated right from the beginning, as a documentary crew has been invited to film them in order to discuss if such special private schools even deserve to have the taxpayers' money. This whole fiasco soon turns out to be intrusive, with the searching of rooms and framing of all the boys of the school in a rather negative light. You have to understand that this school very specifically takes in volatile but intellectually driven teenagers like Shy, Riley, Benny, Ash, Nabil, and Jamie. But even though they are funny and seem to have a chance at a bright future, almost all of these boys carry around an invisible noose of heavy grief, anger, and trauma around their necks. It's teachers like Steve and Amanda who give them a chance at life by constantly fighting to provide them with some form of dignity and hope, even if they're heavily understaffed, constantly criticized for the school's high cost, while also being disgustingly underpaid. Anyways, this documentary crew is about to witness Steve in action on a normal day in his life, but sadly things go south as they watch everything descend into a complete state of chaos. Soon, Steve finds out that his Stanton Woods has been sold, giving the staff only 6 months to shut down while also displacing the boys in the middle of the year. This news definitely hits him hard because, as demanding as his job was, Steve loved the school and strongly believed in its objective that troubled kids and juvenile offenders deserved a second chance if someone was kind enough to prepare them before letting them take on the world by themselves. Steve knew in his heart that a regular school wouldn't care to cater to the needs of such troubled kids, meaning they needed specialized care to help them develop their moral conscience. But now, it seems like Julian and Charlotte were hitting a reset button on his dream, as what was once envisioned as a center of excellence has now been cut down to the bone with years of brutal budget slashes.
Maybe here, at Stanton Wood Manor, it's all of...
How did this news affect Steve? In general, Steve's days were anything but calm. He always had more on his plate than he could manage, but with the constant funding crisis, hiring extra help just wasn't an option. Still, Steve believed so deeply in the school's mission that he was willing to stretch himself thin if it meant that his students had a shot at living with dignity. Now, to the outside world, these kids looked like nothing more than troublemakers with no real future, but Steve knew better. He individually knew each of them inside and out, their quirks, their strengths, and the sparks of potential that most people chose to ignore. Steve felt that all they needed was someone to recognize that potential and give them the right push, and he was determined to be that person. Thankfully, Steve wasn't alone, and he had Amanda, his deputy head, and Shola, the newest teacher, along with Andy and Owen, who rounded out the small team. Even so, Steve was still juggling everything by himself as he was handling logistics, keeping tabs on the kids, and now, on top of all that, dealing with the chaos of a documentary crew whose cameras further seemed to unsettle the rhythm of daily life at the school. Amidst this chaos, Steve also had his ill-fated meeting with Julian and Charlotte. He figured they'd probably talk about cutting back on expenses, or maybe even something as harsh as shutting off the heaters for the winter. But what they told him was far worse. The school had already been sold, which meant that the kids would soon have nowhere to go. There was not nearly enough time to find them another safe place. Steve tried to make them understand. He told them how messy and fragile these kids' lives were, how badly they needed a place that felt permanent, somewhere they could always come back to. But Julian shut him down as their decision was final and there would be no turning back. The news clearly crushed him, as he had built this school into a lifeline and now it was slipping away. He took his pills, hoping they would dull the edge of it all, but they barely made a dent. What kept haunting him was the thought of the day his students would look at him and ask what came next, and he'd have nothing to tell them. He had promised them hope, but now he couldn't even guarantee them a roof. As if things weren't bad enough, that same day, MP Hugh Montague Powell dropped by, hoping to score political points by urging the boys to vote wisely. The whole stunt simply backfired, and the politician stormed off frustrated. Steve barely noticed as he simply didn't have the energy to care. Later that night, drained and defeated, he reached for the booze and the vial of oxycodone he had hidden away in order to try and numb the reality before him.
Well, you're top of my list today, right? So we'll find a time to chat.
Steve was clearly a struggling addict. Like anyone would, Steve also struggled to cope with the news and spiraled out of control as he now felt helpless about saving the boys. So he coped with a few bottles of wine and an entire vial of oxycodone to help calm his jittery nerves. Meanwhile, Jenna, the therapist, kept complaining about Steve's inability to give her enough time to discuss the progress of the students with him because a lot had happened in a short span. Jenna noticed that one of their students, Shy, was going through a rough patch but refused to talk about it. He was clearly losing the will to go on as he had simply given up on journaling, his morning routine, even his breathing exercises. In fact, Jenna suspected that he had resorted to weed in order to cope with his feelings. Moreover, another student named Tyrone made a gross sexual remark at Shola, which would get him right behind bars if this were a public school, but Stanton Woods had been lenient on him and hoped that self-reflection would help him learn better. From Jenna's conversation with Tyrone, we learned that these boys really missed their families because they all wished to return to their safe spaces even if they struggled to cope with their familial environment. This further underlines how important the Institute really was for the boys, because without it, these frustrated kids would have gone back to their usual problematic ways and ultimately ended up in prison. Jenna knew Steve cared about the boys, but was afraid that he was trying to take on too much responsibility and clearly struggling with it. Even Amanda noticed how unusually restless Steve was and sensed that he must have taken something to cope with the stress. Soon, everything makes sense when we gradually find out that Steve has been injured in a devastating accident a few years ago, and the doctor prescribed him with oxycodone, which eventually became an addiction. Plus, a little girl had died because of this accident, and Steve couldn't process it, even if it wasn't his fault. It was just easier for him not to address the continuous guilt he had to live with, but Amanda knew just how much it weighed on him. It definitely didn't help that his colleagues viewed him as a sorted-out person, because now Steve had finally started to lose control, especially after finding out that the cause he had dedicated his entire life to never really amounted to the kind of impact he had hoped. Each day for him had become a battle to make ends meet in order to keep the school running. That's probably why, when Shy asked if his alcoholism was the reason behind wanting to save the boys, Steve's brain snapped. He'd always believed that his purpose was rooted in his own self-interest, but that comment made him realize that his guilt was his main driving force. Steve couldn't shake the thought that by turning to pills and alcohol, he was no different from the kids he was trying so hard to help. Just like them, he was grasping for the quickest escape instead of facing it head on. The realization left him ashamed, as he had always wanted to be their rock, but now he was embarrassed at his own weakness and completely lost on how to deal with the situation.
Please tell me you know it's not all right to be out here at, like, breakfast time getting fully baked.
What makes Shy the emotional anchor of the film? The film's emotional core comes with the 17-year-old Shy who likes to keep his pain private, even if Shola and Jenny sense his withdrawal. Jenny warns Steve that Shy is in real danger, but Steve was a bit too numb from his addiction to prescription opioids and his lingering guilt from the past. Now, Shy had wrestled with addiction since an early age, but after hurting a kid and his stepfather, he had been making real efforts to turn his life around, leaning on Jenna's guidance to better manage his emotions. Even still, he was still finding his footing. At the very start of Steve's program, Shy was caught smoking a joint, even though drugs were strictly off-limit on the premises. Steve noticed it, but didn't make a scene. He understood that Shy wasn't fully ready to navigate the world outside, but he could see that he was trying, and that effort mattered more than perfection. But everything changed for Shy when his mother cut ties with him over a call for losing his temper and repeatedly insulting them. At first, Shy didn't think it was that serious, as he thought parents could never really truly turn their backs on their children, but the reality hit him like a punch in the chest. He was crushed, as the idea of never being able to go home and losing the support he had taken for granted left him feeling hollow and lost. Even though the staff at the school constantly reminded him that they wanted him to share everything he felt, Shy couldn't bring himself to open up. He believed no one could know him the way his mother did, and felt like the emotional weight he was carrying was something no one could ever understand, leaving him isolated in his pain. Shy often said that if he could go back in time, he'd visit his Nana's house and longed for those simple, carefree days when he was just a kid As his mistakes didn't define him, he was loved no matter what mess he made. His Nana's home had been his safe haven, one place where he felt truly seen and accepted. All he wanted was a chance to relive those moments, and hold on to that innocence a little longer. It was a reminder of the heavy guilt these kids carried. Living with the constant fear of disappointing the people they loved was exhausting. When their parents gave up on them, it felt like the entire world had abandoned them. The weight of that rejection was almost impossible to bear. In the final moments of Steve's story, we see Shy reach his breaking point as he fills a bag with stones and walks to a nearby lake, ready to end his life. But something shifts inside him at the last second. Instead of using the stones to drag himself under, Shy hurled them through the school's glass windows, shattering them to grab everyone's attention. Back in his room, he'd left a note, and when Steve read it, he feared he was already too late. In the film's ending, we see an exhausted and drunk Steve rally the staff to search for him. Even as he stumbles and falls into a ditch, his past guidance echoes in Shy's mind, leading the boy to choose life over despair. Though Steve feels like a failure, saving Shy proves the quiet power of his work at Stanton Woods. When Shy comes back to the school grounds, alive, that sight left Steve flooded with relief. At any other school, smashing windows would have been treated as a serious offense, but at Stanton Woods, the act meant something deeper, because at that moment, Shy had chosen not to disappear, but to reach out, to remind himself and everyone else that he still had a community worth returning to. And in that moment, the rules mattered far less than the fact that he'd found the strength to come back. Later, back home, Steve is greeted by his daughters and his supportive wife, who urges him to rest. Yet he can't. The final scenes show him retreating to the attic with a bottle. Is he hiding the alcohol, preparing to leave, or simply losing faith in everything he's built? The ending suggests that just as Steve saved Shy, he now needs saving himself. But that's just our 2 cents. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments section down below.